Where are we at? 15,
Verse 12.
verse 12. Tony or all of us?
No, we didn't read yet, did
Didn't
we?
read any of that at all. Okay, we've got through, we're starting there.
Now mine breaks at 18. Or do you
Mine
think we can
does
get?
too.
Do
Mine
you think we
too.
can get through that whole thing? It's 10 till. I think
Yeah,
we ought to just.
let's do 18 and then we can always move on.
Yeah.
Okay.
My reading for Tony through 18 is very short.
If a fellow Hebrew sells himself or herself to be your servant and serves you for 6 years, in the 7th year you must set that servant free. When you release a male servant, do not send him away empty-handed. Give him a generous farewell gift from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Share with him some of the bounty which the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were once slaves in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I'm giving you this command. Now, this is the really interesting part. But suppose your servant says, I will not leave you, because he loves you and your family, and he has done well with you. In that case, take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door. After that, he will be your servant for life, and do the same for your female servants. You must not yeah, an awl.
Oh my gosh.
You must not consider it a hardship when you release your servants. Remember that for 6 years, they had given you services worth double the wage of hired workers, and the Lord your God will bless you in all you do.
If I was that servant and I knew that was what it was going to come to, I don't know if I'd want to stay.
Well, it was kind of like a tattoo. I think it was either John or I think it was John that said, like, I'm your bond servant, which is what that means. Like, so that was like their tattoo of I belong to.
Their
Right.
brand.
Yeah. Whenever you're ready there, Cindy.
15:12. If your brother is sold. In the context of verses 1 to 11, the reason for the sale would be default, an alternative repayment of a debt, and a period of servitude would substitute for that repayment. The Hebrew slave would serve his master for 6 years following the sale, with freedom being declared in the 7th year. 15:13. You shall not let him go away empty-handed. When a slave had completed his time of service, his former owner was to make ample provision for him so that he would not begin his state of new freedom in destitution. 15:15. Remember, the Israelites formerly enslaved in Egypt were to treat their own slaves as God had treated them. 15:17. And all through his ear. In certain circumstances, a slave might prefer to remain with the family after the required 6 years of servitude. He would then be marked with a hole in his ear and become a servant forever. And there's a reference to Exodus 21, verses 5 and 6. 15:18, worth a doubled hired servant. The slave was worth double to his owner because the owner not only had the service of the slave, but he also did not have to pay out anything for that service as he would for a hired hand. And that's it.
Is anybody
I'm
looking
looking
at
up the
Exodus?
Exodus.
Okay.
You got it,
I have
Kathy?
it.
Go
Yeah.
ahead.
But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be his servant for life.
Oh, that's interesting because his family would have still been with the owner. But that was saying if they didn't want to leave their wife and children.
Or is it the owner's wife and children? Which,
I love my master and my wife and children and do not. Yeah, I love my master and my wife and children and do not want to go free. There's no footnote for that,
Mm-mm,
but
I
it
don't
makes
have
it
any.
sound, kind of makes it sound like he would be left go, but not his
What's
wife
the,
and
what's
kids.
the,
Was it the slave women that the women would use if if they were barren, they would use them to bear
oh, like the
children?
handmaid?
Are they this, is that the same, or are they in a different category? I don't know.
It says an Israelite, for instance, Tony's reference says for Exodus, an Israelite, for instance, might sell himself into slavery, that is, an indentured servant, for various reasons, such as paying off debt or surviving financial calamity. He would serve a period of 6 years and then go free unless he elected to stay in permanent servitude out of love for his master and family. Since slaves were in a vulnerable position, provisions were made to ensure their proper treatment, especially in cases involving female slaves.
That's pretty much what John says about that too, John MacArthur.
I was thinking though, you know, like how there's so much debt today, this system would have kept the borrower from borrowing too much and it would have kept the lender from lending too much because they would have had to forgive the debt in that 7 years. And they would have, the borrower, like even if the borrower said, oh yeah, no, I can afford a $500,000 home, the lender might have been like, you're not gonna be able to pay that back in 7 years, so I'm not giving you that kind of money. I mean, that's a good check balance for debt. Kathy, you ready for Worsby, or do you want me to do
Yeah,
10?
no, I'm ready. I was kind of looking
Okay.
in Worsby to see what it said about that, but it didn't
Oh.
really mention a whole lot.
Okay.
Well, it only said that you can't, as a person loaning, being the loaner, you are not allowed to say if it's the 6th year, or is it, you can't say, I'm not going to loan to you because there's no way you're going to get that debt paid off. But it only said it was at the end of the loan. It didn't say like at the beginning of the loan, when you're talking about it, is it really feasible that you're going to get that paid off in
Yeah,
7
and I
years?
kind of feel like I thought about that yesterday after we got off, because I kind of felt like, say Julie, something catastrophic happens to her in year 4 or year 5, and she needed a certain amount of money to be able to survive or live as a human. For me, then, as the lender, to say, I'm not going to give you that because you can't give it back to me. God, like God was saying, don't do that. Like, care about the person more than making the money. Like, did anybody else take that yesterday? Is that what he was saying?
I think so.
Which is
Okay,
interesting
great.
because in Isaiah, they did end up like abusing their brothers and Jewish brothers and sisters.
Was that whole thing just about lending money to someone who's poor, or lending money, period?
I think it was the rules for lending money to another, like within the Jewish people, wasn't it? Because I think there was something that said like the aliens among you, it didn't apply to them.
Right.
Okay, the indentured servant, verses 12 to 15 and 18. Jewish debtors unable to repay their loans could become indentured servants in the household of the man to whom they were indebted, and in that way work off the debt. The Jews were not allowed to enslave their fellow Jews, although they could have slaves from other nations. and there's a reference to Leviticus. Male servants were to be released after 6 years of service. Male servants were to be released after 6 years of service, whether the
Oh,
seventh year was,
interesting.
was the Sabbath year or not. This law assumes that the man's 6 years of service without a salary had adequately repaid the loan. But once again, the Lord commanded generosity, for the masters were to send their servants away bearing gifts that would help them start life over again, including livestock, grain, and wine. After all, when the Jews left Egypt, they received expensive gifts in return for their years of enslavement. And there's reference to Exodus there. So why shouldn't a Jewish brother be rewarded for 6 years of faithful labor to a fellow Jew? The willing servant, verses 16 to 18. During those 6 years of service, the debtor might come to love the host family and want to stay with them. Or he might have gotten married during that time and have a family and want to remain with them. Which here again makes it sound like he can go, but the family can't go. If that was the debtor's choice, he would be taken to the judges where his decision would be officially recognized. Then his master would bore a hole in his ear to mark him as a willing servant for life. A female servant could make the same choice, but see Exodus 21, 7 to 11 for provisions. So apparently it talks about the female in Exodus.
What's that again? Exodus.
I have it.
Exodus, you do? Exodus 21, 7 to 11.
If a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not be freed at the end of 6 years as the men are. If she does not please the man who bought her, then he shall let her be bought back again, but he has no power to sell her to foreigners, since he has wronged her by no longer wanting her after marrying her. And if he arranges an engagement between a Hebrew slave girl and his son, then he may no longer treat her as a slave girl, but must treat her as a daughter. If he himself marries her and then takes another wife, he may not reduce her food or clothing or fail to sleep with her as his wife. If he fails in any of these three things, then she may leave freely without any payment.
So this takes me to that book that Stan and I've been reading about marriage and divorce in the church, because this Exodus verse right here, reread the conditions of marriage. He had to feed, clothe, and sleep with her. He could not he couldn't neglect her in any of these areas. So a lot of people are like, oh, well, Joseph, slept with Leah. Well, when Joseph married Leah, there was a contract where he agreed to feed, clothe, and not reject her with conjugal love. There were all these other conditions. And if he would have divorced her, he would have had to given her the money so she could go start her life.
Well, it's interesting though that it says, if she does not please the man who bought her, then he shall let her be bought back again. I mean, what's involved with that? If this is a slave girl required to sleep with this owner?
I don't know, because when you got married, like, he would have given a dowry, but to me that doesn't make her a slave,
I know.
because you would have had a contract for that marriage.
Okay.
I don't understand that.
Certainly there's a spiritual message here for God's people today. We should love our Lord so much that we should want to serve him willingly and gladly all our lives. We must never look upon our service as slavery, but as privilege. I love my master and don't want to go free is a wonderful confession of faith and love. Granted, The servant's love for his wife and children entered into the picture, but even those blessings came because of his master's kindness, and the master was caring for them as well as his servant. What we all need is to open ear to hear for God's will. And there are references to Psalms and Isaiah. What we all need is to open ear to hear God's will, and a pierced ear that announces we love him and are ready to obey his every command. The emphasis in this section is on faith that produces generosity. If we are hard-hearted or tight-fisted, it's evidence that we don't really believe that God keeps his promises and provides for those who give to the needy. Jesus became poor that he might make us rich. And there's a reference to 2 Corinthians. And he blesses us that we might be a blessing to others.
I just went back here and Tony to that 21, Kim. It says, I mean, this is dealing specifically with slaves. So, I mean, I guess they could do what they wanted, but if they took her on as a wife, they had a responsibility to her.
So even though she's married to the slave, she can be married to the master.
No, I don't think so, because it says love for his master and family. Since slaves were in a vulnerable position, provisions were made to ensure their proper treatment. So if the slave owner had married her.
This whole verse 7 and 8 just doesn't make sense to me.
In Exodus?
Yes. If a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not be freed at the end of the 6 years as men are. Period. If she does not please the man who bought her, then he shall let her be bought back again, but he has no power to sell her to foreigners, since he has wronged her by no longer wanting her after marrying her.
So divorce is happening because he bought her, he paid a dowry for her, he took her on, he's to provide clothing and shelter and conjugal love and treat her well, because that's what that's saying. You can treat her well. But if you decide you don't want her, then you can send her back, and he would have to provide for her. They couldn't sell her to strangers, right?
So a daughter who is sold as a slave is
For the
actually
father's death.
marrying the slave owner.
Can be.
Do you want to hear what Worsby says about that?
Yeah.
Though the Jews were permitted to own slaves from other nations, usually prisoners of war, they were not allowed to enslave their own people. Okay, if because of poverty a Jew had to become an indentured servant, his master had to treat him humanely and release him after 6 years of service. If because of family affection the man wanted to remain in service and the judges approved it, then he would be marked in the earlobe and remain a servant for the rest of his life. However, he was never to be treated like a slave. A female servant wasn't automatically set free after 6 years. If a poor man sold his daughter to be a servant or a concubine, then the girl's father would receive the sale price. The girl would get a better home, and her husband wouldn't have to pay a costly dowry. If after becoming the man's concubine she didn't please him, somebody in her birth family could redeem her and she would be set free. If
Like
the man had chosen,
like Ruth.
yeah,
She had a redeemer in the family, Boaz. Go ahead, I'm
if
sorry.
the man had chosen her for his son and the son came to dislike her and married another woman, then the son's father had to be sure she was treated like a married daughter. That meant making sure she had clothing, food, and her conjugal rights. If the father failed to do this, the woman was free to return to her family home and was not considered a slave.
My 21, in Exodus says, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he must go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. So if he was married when he became a slave, his wife could leave with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be the master's. So it says, and he shall go out alone. So that's why it's saying if he doesn't want to leave his family.
Wow.
But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost. The master shall bore his ear through and with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. So if he came in with a wife, he got to leave with the wife. But if he came in single and the master gave him a wife and they had children, they had to stay with the master. That makes sense. Makes more sense. Then it
Yeah.
goes on to say, but when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself. Let me see what this says down here. Then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to foreign people, since he has broken faith with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, clothing, or marital rights. So, like when Joseph married Leah, married Leah, he
Oh,
couldn't
Jacob.
deny Jacob. Thank you. He couldn't deny her the conjugal rights, clothing, or shelter. He still had to take care of her, even though he married Rachel. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing without payment of money. Like he can't make money off of her. So if he refused to treat her right, he couldn't get money for her. Interesting how we've never read that before, but now that I read that marriage book, it's like, oh, yeah, it does say that.
See, that could turn into a he said, she said.
Mm-hmm.
And women's opinions were not valued at all.
Well, and there was
Uh,
never divorce certificates because so it used to be that if a man, did I already say this before? Because I can't remember who I talked to. If the man decided he didn't want her anymore, so I'm married and Stan decides he doesn't want to be married, all he had to do in the Roman culture is just walk out the door. And he could be gone for 5 years. And then I would meet a nice man and he would come in and he would start raising my children, teach them skills, treat me lovely. And then Stan would have the right to come back into my life, however many years later, 5 years later, when he saw my children were good worker, our children were good workers, and he could make money off them. He could come back and reclaim me. And my new husband would be out of luck. So the divorce certificate was given to give the Israelite women a right to remarry freely and not have to worry about that. And if that man decided to divorce her, he had to give her her dowry back so that she had money to start her life on.
I don't think I would fit in very well back in those days.
I don't
We
think
weren't-
too many of us would.
We weren't raised that way.
Well, and the other thing it is that verse that says about not being able to remarry, like you can't go back and remarry your I don't know how it's worded, like your spouse again. So like if Stan, he couldn't get rid of me and then come back and remarry me because what would happen is they would get a double dowry. They'd get rid of you and then they come to marry you again because the father also gave this dowry to the husband to help build the house. So that wasn't because of you couldn't remarry, it was because the man could do it as a financial gain scheme. Our understanding of that whole thing is like been jaded. But anyway, I'm
You
sorry.
know that
I feel like I
Hallmark
cut
movie
you
I
off.
watched the other week about the Jewish people, and it was the case where the brother died, no children, so her husband, and so her brother-in-law came, and they were going through the ceremony to let him off the hook, not have to marry her. And that was crazy. I mean, he had to put a divorce shoe on, and she had to kneel down before him and untie the shoe and lift his foot up. It's Jewish people, they have some weird stuff going on. And it came to the part where he had to spit to say he was disowning his brother, and he couldn't do that. So they ended up getting together. Of course, it was a Hallmark movie. But they have so many, what are they called? You know, things that they have to do.
They like,
Rituals, yeah.
they like kissed her hand and then touched the doorpost when they came into the house.
Yeah, they did that all the time. But it was very interesting to watch the whole thing play out. I mean, there were like 3 rabbis there, and it was a big ceremony.
Cindy, did I cut you off? I feel like you were in the middle of saying something and I cut you off.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't,
If I did, I'm sorry.
no, not at all.
That was all I had.
Okay, so I'm on 12 to 18, right? 12, commands regarding the Sabbath year continue in 15, 12 through 18. A fellow Hebrew who was too poor to repay his debts could sell himself to his debtor as an indentured servant, but in the 7th year he was to be set free. Leviticus 25, 13 through 18. Furthermore, the newly released servant was to be set up with everything he needed to make a successful fresh start. A Hebrew, that is an Israelite, was to give generously to his former servant based on how the Lord had blessed him. He was also to remember that he was once worse off than an indentured servant. He was a slave in the land of Egypt. To any Israelite who considered it too much of a financial hardship to lose a valuable worker and to give him a generous severance package on the 7th year, Moses gave this reminder: getting 6 years of hard work without having to pay a hired worker is a good deal. Nevertheless, if a servant loved his situation, provision was made for him to stay with the family he served for life. Sadly, Israel would fail to keep the sabbatical years and the rules surrounding the year Jubilee that are discussed in this passage and elsewhere. You can see Leviticus 25, 1 through 55. And since the Lord warned them that if they rejected his commands and rebelled against his way, he would cast them out of the land so that the land could enjoy its Sabbath rests. See Leviticus 26, 33 through 35. That is exactly what would happen. See 2 Chronicles 36, 20, and 21. The end. Any thoughts? If not, we can, what time is it? 10:16. We could do that last little section if everybody is okay. If someone needs to go, we can wait till tomorrow.
I'm good.
All right, someone will go ahead and read it.
I will. Firstborn animals. You shall set aside for God all the firstborn males from your flocks and herds. Do not use the firstborn of your herds to work your fields, and do not shear the firstborn of your flocks of sheep and goats. Instead, you and your family shall eat these animals before the Lord your God each year at his sanctuary. However, if this firstborn animal has any defect, such as being lame or blind, or if anything else is wrong with it, you shall not sacrifice it. Instead, use it for food for your family at home. Anyone, even if ceremonially defiled at the time, may eat it, just as anyone may eat a gazelle or deer. But don't eat the blood, pour it out upon the ground like water.
Hey, Cindy, whenever you're ready. Mine's very short for that.
$15.19. All the firstborn sanctify. The firstborn was the first to be produced during the bearing life of an animal. It was to be consecrated to the Lord. The firstborn would be sacrificed annually, and the offerers would participate in the sacrificial meal, nor share. The firstborn ox or bull was not to be worked, nor was the firstborn sheep or goat to be shorn in the time before their sacrifice to the Lord. 1521, a defect. An imperfect firstborn animal was not acceptable as a sacrifice. It was to be treated like any other non-sacrificial animal and eaten at home. That's it.
Whenever you're ready, Kathy.
Okay, he kind of breaks this up a little weird here. A celebrating people. The Lord gave Israel a unique calendar to help his people remember who they were and to encourage them to review all he had done for them. And following this calendar of special events year by year, the Jews would find cause for great celebration. But this calendar also belongs to believers today because it illustrates what Christ has done for his church and what he will do when he comes again. As the Jewish people followed this calendar year by year, they had every reason for great celebration because of the Lord's mercies to their ancestors and to them. As we study this calendar, we give thanks and rejoice that we have so great a salvation and such a great Savior. On the seventh day of the week, the Jews celebrated the Sabbath. God gave them the Sabbath as a sign that they were his special covenant people and belonged to the creator of the universe. Reference to Exodus. There's no record in scripture.
Are you in 16? Is he doing 16 together?
Well, he has 15 to 19, 15, 19 to 16, 8.
Okay, because the next section, it looks like it is the calendar, like Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths.
Yeah, he kind of has it running together here.
Okay.
Do you want me to hold off or?
I don't know. Is it long?
It's a little bit lengthy because then it goes, the next section is Passover and unleavened bread, and it's 15:19 to 16:8 again. And then it goes on down to 16:9 to 12. So it kind of all runs together.
I guess maybe wait then, because the seventh day is down at it's down at like verse 7 of 16.
Okay. I'll hold off then till we get to chapter 16.
Yeah, because I feel like we're gonna want to make notes on that. This is God's calendar that he set up.
Okay.
Okay, so my 19 to 23 is very short. It says the following verses deal with giving up possessions to the Lord. Moses had just mentioned the Israelite slavery in Egypt, so they knew well that every firstborn male among their animals belonged to God. These creatures, the best of the herds and flocks, were to be brought to the sanctuary for sacrifice. Those which had a defect could be eaten at home like any other animal, provided the blood was properly drained first. So if it was the firstborn, but it was defect, they couldn't take to the sanctuary. Did they take nothing to the sanctuary then?
You're asking us?
Yeah, like and it says every firstborn male.
Well, it didn't give an instead. It didn't say instead you can do this or instead you can do that.
No. If they had only if they were perfect, could they go to the sanctuary?
Well, and it makes me wonder too, just how often can you get perfect?
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I was wondering, like how many, I mean, and if you have huge flocks and it's every firstborn male, is it out of the entire flock or is it just the first one born in that season from the entire flock?
We need a Jew.
We do. Because it says every firstborn male among their animals.
I
I'm
would think
reading
it's
that.
for the season.
It seems like that would make sense because you would have, if you had huge flocks, like if you're a farmer, that could be a lot of males.
I'm understanding it to say the firstborn you and your family shall eat before the Lord your God each year at his sanctuary. So throughout the year, they're eating their firstborn. However, if the firstborn has a defect, you shall not sacrifice it. So is sacrificing different from eating?
Well, I would think I would think sacrifice is done at the temple.
And yeah, and
Because
it
it says,
says,
God said,
"Instead,
you'll sacrifice at the place I say you sacrifice. Remember, he was really specific about that this past week about you just didn't sacrifice anywhere.
so instead use it for food. So the firstborn defect could be used for food, but not for sacrifice. Only the perfect ones for sacrifice.
Right.
But they could eat anything, that was firstborn.
Yeah, it says, but okay, so yeah, I'm going back here 20. It says, but if it has any blemish, if it is lame or blind or has any serious blemish, whatever, you shall not sacrifice it to the Lord your God, but you can eat it within your towns.
Well, maybe they didn't sacrifice that year if they didn't have a perfect firstborn.
Yeah.
How often? Is it just once a year they had to sacrifice?
They had different ones, so I don't know. We're studying Leviticus on Mondays too, and it's been confusing because it's like, is it just the leaders of each tribe? And back then the families would have been like the patriarch, and then inside that home, I don't know. I'll let you know as we go further into Leviticus.
There's a reference in my Bible to Leviticus 22, and I just went back and looked to see if that didn't really clarify anything either.
I guess they
I don't
still
think.
killed the firstborn, but to sacrifice it in the sanctuary, it had to be perfect.
So maybe God realized that it's hard to find perfect. So I think I kind of get the gist that the thing is, don't try to pass it off. If you know it's not perfect, then don't try to pass it off as if it is, because God's going to know. So rather than try to pass it off, don't do anything. I don't know. That's just kind of the way I kind of look at it.
I'm thinking the same thing, Kathy. If you don't have a perfect specimen to offer for sacrifice, I don't think they had to sacrifice anything.
Yeah. Because I mean, even if you do, God knows it's not. So even if you're trying your best, it still looks like it's less than good enough.
Well, it doesn't say if the second-born is perfect, use it.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that.
I would think there would be some arrogance though that might come if you were the farmer who had the perfect lamb. Like
some,
my lamb was perfect, so I could take it to the sanctuary, but you couldn't take yours.
Well, were they able to use their sacrifice for was it a community sacrifice or just their family? Maybe.
Well, it says in your towns in my Bible, you shall eat it within your towns.
I mean, the
So
sacrifice.
like maybe general provision of meat. Maybe the firstborn was always killed, but had to be perfect to be taken to the sacrifice to
Yeah.
the Lord at the temple.
Yes. Yes,
And-
so
and can-
and so that if the sacrifice, the ones that were perfect and were able to be sacrificed, would that be a community sacrifice as well? I'm wondering. Because they are rare. It's more rare. Everybody would be happy that, oh, neighbor Jones got a perfect firstborn to sacrifice. We don't have to worry about it.
That would be good.
Yeah.
My Bible has a couple, it doesn't really address that though, but it has like for 1 through 6, it says relief from misery. Financial poverty and debt is a crushing experience, making the indebted person or family feel that there's little or no hope for escape. Isn't that true? So binding is financial poverty that the Lord inspired the authors of scripture to include instructions on how to properly handle finances. And then it gives a whole bunch of references, all Old Testament and New Testament. In cases where Israelites owed a debt to a fellow countryman, Moses commanded that the creditor release the debtor after 7 years, offering relief to the oppressive realities of being in debt. How great was this news to those crushed by unending financial obligations? This financial relief points to the proclamation of Jesus bringing good news to the poor, offering freedom from various forms of intense suffering. While we do not have the same legal statutes in place to offer freedom from debt every 7 years, Jesus offers the Lord's favor in the midst of human sorrow. Our physical circumstances may not change, but Jesus provides relief and comfort to those struggling under oppression or crushing experiences. He offers the kingdom of God to his followers, a sure blessing that will include a wonderful and worshipful exchange of our current sufferings for blessing without end in the eternal presence of God. Then there's one for 1 through 18. It says, to be released from an overwhelming debt is a tremendous experience. In this chapter, the Lord wanted his people to see this concept within the larger framework of his mercy to them. The primary theme in this chapter is Jubilee, which started on the Day of Atonement to symbolize that Israel's sins had been paid for, Leviticus 25. This celebratory concept was intended to remind the Israelites of God's act to rescue them from Egyptian bondage, Deuteronomy 15:15, with applications for contemporary considerations, such as releasing people from their debts and being generous to the poor. Ultimately, the Israelites were expected to cancel various bondages like indentured servants, debts, or liens on land based on God's gracious mercy toward them as a people. This practice prefigured the ultimate jubilee offered by God through Christ's atonement for our debt to sin. In the same way that the Israelites were enslaved to the Egyptians and were unable to free themselves, all people are hopelessly bound to sin apart from Christ's act on their behalf to offer them freedom. His death and resurrection as a payment for debt of sin is the only means that God the Father has provided for people to be reconciled to God. He gives people the credit needed to be free from sin and death. He became the benefactor, willing to make a payment and release them from a line of credit that proved to be beyond their capability to pay. Where all people were dead through Adam, Christ has brought to life all who believe the gospel and are redeemed by the Lord. Theologians refer to this transaction as the Great Exchange, meaning what was due to mankind because of our sin was transferred to Jesus, and what was due to him because of his perfection was transferred to believers. He took the wrath of God on our behalf, transferred to us the blessings of the Father, which we had absolutely no right to claim. Indeed, Christians have a ransom to shout to the nations that we have Jubilee in Jesus. The end. Any other thoughts? All right, this concludes the reading of God's word for today. We made it through an entire chapter then. We'll pick up at 16 tomorrow.